The Economist.
On yesterday's show, we took a look at Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to America, how the Ukrainian president, with a plan for victory in his pocket, is shoring up support at the UN and among America's presidential contenders. This is the picture that much of the world gets. Mr. Zelensky as avatar of Ukraine's people, their resolve, their unity of purpose. On the ground, it is far, far more complicated. So we're going to take you there. I'm Jason Palmer, and this is The Weekend Intelligence. Our editor-in-chief, Zeni Minton-Beddoes, traveled to Ukraine, meeting generals, soldiers, and civilians near the front lines to get a real gauge of the answer to a question that Mr. Zelensky is not posing. What kind of an end to this war is good enough?
Somewhere near here, we've been given a drop pin to meet Ivan Beryak, the deputy commander of the 93rd Brigade. Going up the hill onto a sort of skyline.
This part of Ukraine is flat, nearly as far as the eye can see, which on a clear day in mid-September is quite far. The sky stretches across a basin full of mining towns, where the main geographic features are not hills or mountains, but landscaped piles of rock and earth, dug from the ground, minerals extracted, and then smoothed into flat-top mounds called slag heaps.
I see, they're waiting for us. There's a vehicle there. Ooh, a pickup truck. Some soldiers around it. So we have a very good view of Drushkivka. And the surrounding countryside. There's somebody with an aerial.
The names of these small towns and villages might not be familiar to you yet, but they may soon become as infamous as Bakhmut, directly to the east of me. That city was almost entirely razed last year by the Russians' campaign to get control of it, which they do now. It's a blackened and destroyed prize. To the south of me is Pokrovsk, which many worry will likely suffer the same fate. You can't see the Russian positions with the naked eye.
We have a higher bit here. So they're behind us, 12 kilometers behind us. But you have, and if you stand up, can you see their lines?
No,
it's a little bit further.
No.
Not possible. But 12 kilometers.
Better through the scope of a rifle, jokes our guide Ivan. But they're close.
And can their drones see us?
Tak.
Okay, well let's move before they see us too much.
And somewhere out there, though I can't see him either, is Vlad.
My call name is Pride. I'm captain, commander of the mortar unit. I'm staying in a field, not far from my positions. I'm really close to the front line. You can hear the sound of explodes. Under my command is like 42 people. So, to add some context, we are now fighting in the Donetsk region. Half of my men and women are staying on battle positions, really close to the enemies, and working from the mortars. Ну ладно, показывай.
Overhead, always, are the drones. Vlad has been keeping an audio diary for us during a crucial period at a crucial part of the front line. Russian and Ukrainian forces are battling for control of Pokrovsk, that town just south of here. It's a big strategic prize, a mining town and an important transport hub. And with the landscape so flat, there are not many natural defenses between Pokrovsk and the next town, or indeed the administrative boundaries of Donetsk region. The region Putin says he wants to liberate. Lose Pokrovsk, and Russian forces could roll across this plain. That's not Ukraine's only challenge right now. Winter is coming, Some Western partners are tiring, and the US election is only 6 weeks away. It's crunch time for Ukraine, and I've traveled from the east of the country to Washington, D.C. to work out what lies ahead.
Now we're walking along a darkened corridor from the commander's office.
First, I wanted to get a sense of how the war is being fought. And increasingly, that's a cat-and-mouse game between man and drone.
Down towards the cellars, I guess.
In the basement of a nondescript Soviet-era building, I can't tell you exactly where, there are workstations with gaming chairs and banks of screens, each one showing the video feed from a different drone. Hans is in charge of one of them. Anything moves, and he goes after it.
They start moving from this big forest to our position over here. And we see how they start moving.
He shows us the results of his handiwork when a group of Russian armored vehicles tried to move in on a Ukrainian position.
Over here we destroyed one tank. Here BMP, you can see it with video over here.
When I look up, I see that the video feed on one of the live screens has swooped and zoomed in on a tall structure in a brown field. They're on the lookout for both Russian soldiers and Russian equipment.
A Russian soldier come to this antenna and something fixed there on this antenna.
What do you think they fixed to that antenna?
I think this is maybe communication between artillery and some flying.
So that's why you want to take it out?
Yeah.
It's too windy right now, but they'll be back for that antenna later. And they'll monitor Russian communications to find out exactly what it was. It's an impressive operation, all overseen by a young man who goes by the call sign Achilles.
Can I ask you how old you are?
33 years old now.
33 years old. And how long have you been commander for?
It start war of Russia.
Since the start of the war. And yours is one of the most effective drone battalions.
The top 3.
Top 3?
Yes.
Achilles, or Yuri, is 33, with short dark hair, darker eyebrows, and a single earring. The golden hoop with an engraved bell-bottom is a replica of an old Cossack style, an independent Ukrainian warrior class from centuries past. Yuri joined the National Guard at 18 and fought in eastern Ukraine when Russia first invaded in 2014. After he was severely injured, he started a business in Kiev and joined the city council. But since the first day of the full-scale invasion, he's been fighting again alongside his friends, this time as one of Ukraine's drone hotshots.
And what kind of drones do you specialize in?
Kamikadze, Baba Yaga, дальнього радіусу дії з автоматичним наведенням.
At this point, Yuri switches to Ukrainian, and so my colleague, our correspondent Ollie Carroll, is translating.
So it's a whole complex of drones, from the reconnaissance drones to strike drones, kamikaze drones, the bombers, the whole range.
And now, 2.5 years into the war, I am trying to work out what is likely to happen in the next 6 months or 1 year. When you look at your drone capability and the Russians' drone capability, are they ahead?
Говоримо про класи.
So if we're talking about the winged enemy reconnaissance drones, then the enemy is far ahead, because they were preparing for this even before the start of the war in 2014.
Тому противник має перевагу з точки зору виготовлення, модернізації.
So if we're talking about that particular class, it's been modernized. Russia has an obvious superiority there, because Ukraine, in effect, only really started developing its own complexes of this kind at the start of the full-scale invasion.
The picture that emerges is complicated. Russia might still be ahead when it comes to those traditional winged reconnaissance drones, but Ukraine is innovating fast. They're better at creating and using small attack drones, and even using AI for targeting. The problem for Ukraine, as Yuri's boss Vadim Sukharevsky tells me, is scale.
They don't have better drones. They have a lot of drones.
Vadim Sukharevsky is Ukraine's commander of unmanned systems forces. Vadim's role is new, the first of its kind in the world. He thinks it's just as game-changing as the creation of air forces at the beginning of the last century. It's his job to bring the kind of drone technology that Achilles and other tech-savvy brigades are using to the whole of Ukraine's armed forces. He's working on new airborne reconnaissance drones, sea drones, and land-based drones too. It takes an average of 7 small drones to destroy a tank. But near Pokrovsk, where the Russians are throwing not just men, but all their military might, they're protecting equipment with even more electronic jamming.
Sometimes it's 12 drones for one tank.
Multiply that across the entire front, and the numbers are staggering.
Our forces on the front line flying more than 1,300,000 flying on the front line.
1,300,000 drone flights.
Yeah.
In 1 month.
On front line, 1 month.
For Sukharevsky, the focus is less on Western weapons than Western money. He tells me Ukraine can produce better drones more cheaply than anything their partners could send. 250 drone producers are making more than the military can afford to buy off them. Individual brigade commanders are crowdfunding to purchase drones directly from a network of manufacturers, bypassing headquarters entirely. The official position is that Ukraine will fight for Pokrovsk, that if the supply of Western weapons speeds up, its soldiers can hold the line. Not only that, but with enough support they can retake the territory they lost, not just in this war, but back to 2014, when Russia first pushed into the Donbass and seized Crimea. But what I learned in my travels across Ukraine, and the various conversations I had both on the record and off, is that, whisper it, Pokrovsk is in trouble. One senior official told me he considers it already lost. And again, whisper it, but Ukraine won't have the capacity anytime soon to push the Russians out, take back its land, and return to the country's 1991 borders. No one will admit it publicly, but the real point now is to stop the Russian advance for long enough to build realistic defenses, both physical and political, to permanently protect what Ukraine currently has. It's not actually the flat agricultural lands that we're driving through right now that make this really, really important. It's the mining, it's the steel making in Dnipro. We're heading for one of those mining towns, Pavlograd, a town of 100,000 people.
Pavlograd also has an explosives factory, a military complex there. What is interesting about Pavlograd, it still has an active coal mine. A good chunk of the workforce now are women, 500 since 2022. Simply because the local mines have been asked to provide a certain amount of manpower for the front. And it's interesting in not being necessarily what you'd call a frontline city. It is a city where people are near enough and close enough to the missiles that land to be thinking about war every day and about the consequences of what war would look like if it continued.
If Pokrovsk falls, which is clearly a possibility, and the Russians take the rest of the towns and villages on the plains of the Donbass, then Pavlograd will be the last sizable Ukrainian town before the Russians. Before heading in, we pull over to get fuel. What was that bus that just went by? It looked like a kind of police bus. It was a bus with police sirens.
So if you looked closely, at the front of that bus was the sign 300. Now, in military terms, 300 means severely wounded. 200 means dead. And you see these 300 lorries, buses coming past pretty frequently along this road because it's the main road from Pokrovsk and other theatres in the Donbass to Dnipro, one of the best military hospitals. Since 2014, Dnipro has been and here we go, the sirens you hear in the background.
What do you want us to do?
I think we should probably move to a different place now.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go.
So we go to somewhere which is more central and less likely to be hit than a petrol station, which is known to be used by military people.
I don't know, I got really, really sad seeing this bus for some reason.
Man, they're pretty frequent. And the fact it's a big bus as well.
That was a very big bus.
The bigger the losses, the bigger the buses.
The airstrikes, the buses full of wounded and dead soldiers, military vehicles on the roads and at the petrol stations, and soldiers in uniform on the streets. Pavlograd feels like a town in a country at war, something that the larger cities like Kiev and Odessa don't feel like at all. Recent polling suggests that Ukrainians' attitudes towards the war are changing. A bit under half of the population is now open to the idea of a negotiated end to the fighting. The question is on what terms? The vast majority are still opposed to giving up any territory, even Crimea or the parts of the Donbas that Russia has now occupied for a decade. But the number considering it has shot up since last autumn after the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive. 32% of Ukrainians would now consider some territorial concessions in exchange for peace. And the trend is more pronounced in those parts of the country closer to the fighting. And so I was curious about Pavlograd.
Добрый день.
Tatiana is selling flowers in the street, professional-looking bouquets that she's arranged out of cuttings from her own garden. She's cycled here, towing the flowers behind her bike on a red wagon. And in front of the wagon is a handwritten sign. She's not just selling flowers, but an apartment.
So you're selling your apartment?
Ви продаєте свій будинок?
Ні, не свій, це діти продають.
No, it's not mine, it's my children's house.
And why are they selling it?
Чому вони продають?
Вони уїхали до Польщі, купили там помешкання вже, і тут не потрібен будинок їм.
So they left to Poland and they already got an apartment there, so they don't need the apartment.
So they're not coming back?
Вони не повернуться.
Дуже хочуть, але ні.
They really want to come back, but I don't think they will.
And what about you? How do you feel with the front coming closer?
Я дуже люблю Україну, я націоналістка.
I really
І буду робити усе, щоб наша країна виграла цю війну.
I really love Ukraine. I would call myself a nationalist, Ukrainian nationalist, and I will do anything for Ukraine to win this war.
And do you think that most people in Pavlograd share your view, want the war to continue and want a Ukrainian victory?
У нас чимало таких патріотично налаштованих українців, але останній час, коли приїхали звідти, з Донбасу,
So there is quite a lot of people in Pavlograd itself who are like pro-Ukrainian people, but since the big war and we have many people, many incomers from eastern Ukraine, from the Donetsk region, and I would divide them into two groups. Some of them are like they don't care, and the rest they are quite pro-Russian. So now the city is mixed with different views.
And how would you feel if the Russians end up taking all of Donetsk, if they are just 50 kilometers down the road is Russia?
піду в партизан.
I will become a partisan.
And what will you do as a partisan?
І що ви будете робити як партизан?
Їсти варить солдатам.
I would cook for the soldiers.
The Russian ones, she means. And there's a glint in her eye. There's a history to Ukrainian grandmothers poisoning Russian soldiers with pies. Tatiana thinks the Ukrainian soldiers will keep fighting down to the last man.
До останнього українця.
Yes, until the last Ukrainian.
Because there are many people in the West now who say it is time for a peace deal where Russia keeps the territory that it has taken and the Ukraine keeps what it has still got but doesn't get it back.
Не буде.
This will never happen.
Це буде дуже багато крові прольється, але ми не дозволимо.
There will be a lot of blood, but we will never allow this to happen.
So even if the government in Kiev agrees this, you will keep fighting?
Та знесуть українці і уряд, і кацапів, і усіх, хто посягне. Ми ж українці.
Yeah, because we are Ukrainians and we will just destroy the government, the Ukrainian government, and together with Russians. We will be fighting.
But when we catch up back at the car, my colleagues Anastasia Parfenyuk and Arkady Ostrovsky tell me they spoke to others who were less resolute.
Yeah, so one girl, she's 19 years old, she said that She's for anything that can stop fighting, basically. And she says if they want Donbass, let's give it to them.
And a mother whose 2 sons worked in the coal mine here before the full-scale invasion. That's when they signed up to fight. Her younger son died at the front 9 days ago.
Her other son is 41 and she's trying to get him out from the front. She hired a lawyer and basically she lost her husband. She basically lost everything, and after the funeral she's gone blind, half blind. She was sitting there with a 4-year-old grandkid and she said, I just don't care, I just want this to stop.
We pause for lunch at a cafe in central Pavlograd. Sitting at a table outside are 2 young men. Soldiers, but not in uniform, smoking and waiting for their meal. They nod as we walked in with our kit, and then later asked if we're journalists. They clearly have something to say.
Yeah?
Have a seat. Yeah.
And I'll sit.
Come and sit there. Pull in the chair there.
And I'll sit between you guys.
Yeah.
They tell us they are infantry soldiers, deployed at what's called the contact line, the closest to Russian soldiers. We've heard a lot about the meat grinder those Russian soldiers are thrown into, with little regard from their superiors for their lives. But these 2 Ukrainian infantrymen say they feel their commanders don't care about them either.
So, we must say we have not enough weapon. Yep. And we have not enough people.
On their last mission near Pokrovsk, they tell me their commander ordered them to stay in position and protect a piece of expensive equipment, even though they didn't have enough weapons to protect themselves.
If you use some person, like me, you must write 1 paper. If you use some stuff, you must write 3 paper.
3 forms if it is equipment.
Yeah.
So do you think your commanders don't care about your life?
Yeah, of course. I guess so. I am not a cat. I have not 9 wives. I have only 1 wife. And that is why it's very scary.
I can't imagine how scary this must be. And then at the contact line, you are 2 kilometers from the Russians.
Yep.
And so any movement, they have drones, they will see
Yep,
you.
of course.
And describe what life is like for you at the contact line.
It's very difficult.
What do? You're underground?
Yeah, of course. If you find some, если мы найдем типа какую-то
If we find a dugout
яму
or a hole, and if we find a hole.
And what weaponry do you have?
AK-47.
That's it?
Yep.
And your role there is to stop the Russians advancing, and there are more of them.
Of course.
How many people run away?
A lot.
A lot. And is it more people now running away?
Yeah, of course.
What our 2 young soldiers can't bring themselves to say, until much later, is that they themselves are some of the runaways.
We leave our weapon, and our commanders say...
Deserting.
Yep.
So they accuse you of desertion.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do?
I don't know. Maybe now rest. Maybe 1 week.
Are they looking for you? Они тебя ищут?
Конечно, ищут, да.
They told us nearly half the men they fought with had done the same. Across the whole of the armed forces, one senior official told us, the average number is about 10%. That means a total of 100,000 have deserted or gone AWOL. From my conversations with soldiers, commanders, and generals, it's becoming clear to me that the Ukrainian army is not uniform. There are elements of the old Soviet army. What these 2 young runaways told me sounded depressingly similar to the Russian meat grinder. But some individual brigades are well-equipped and well-funded by businessmen and wealthy individuals, or crowdsourced donations that allow them to buy drones, weapons, and body armor directly from Ukraine's growing domestic military industry. Some of these units have waiting lists of 500 men wishing to transfer into them from other parts of the army. They operate with a degree of autonomy and have developed a good reputation, like Achilles, who runs the drone unit. His golden earring, consciously or not, harks back to a very Ukrainian phenomenon, the independent Cossacks, a militarized democracy of semi-autonomous brigades negotiating where and how they fight. An asset now when the country needs motivated men, but an issue if things begin to splinter. It's easy to see what difference a good senior officer can make to the morale of his men. It could mean the difference between life and death.
So I'm now moving through the forest from the positions back to the car, to the jeep. I checked all of three of my position, spoke with my guys, check their hiding spots, everything, how they cover motors, where they live, do they have internet on their position, do they have enough batteries.
Vlad, our commander on the front sending us voice memos from the dugout, prides himself on being one of the good ones, checking in on his men and pulling them back when it's prudent to do so.
I'm sitting in my car in front of my apartment in Konstantinivka, Donetsk region. A few days ago I have a new experience in this war. My guys got a captive, so the Russian soldier. So the whole story was that on my mortar positions become too dangerous.
Some Russian soldiers had somehow snuck through the lines and got very close to his mortar positions. Vlad and his commander decided the team should be pulled out.
I planned the operation, like when the drones, they should bomb the position where Russians stay, and we come by Humvee close to our guys, took them and ran away. And on the way back, I just turn around and I see that in the Humvee was sitting the guy with a bag on his head, and my guys laughing like, oh, we took one Russian with us. So when we came back to the base, we have time to speak with him, to ask questions, who he is, why he came. In general, he like 40-year-old Russian man. He was like 2 years in the army, but doing some help work, you know, like drive from one position to another, far away from the front line. And at this month, his commanders just make an order to, it was close, to put him on the front line, and it was his first fight, and he put his hands up.
That was not an isolated incident. Ukrainian officials say it's increasingly common. Russia is pressing cooks and drivers to the front line, and those who refuse to fight are locked in basements and beaten into compliance. The Russians are now paying 4 times as much as at the beginning of the war to entice men into the army. In August, Ukraine launched a surprise incursion into Russia itself, claiming more than 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, which President Zelensky said he would hold on to indefinitely. A bold move, and while it didn't pull as many Russian resources from the Eastern Front as the Ukrainian top brass might have hoped, it was a major bump in morale. And it demonstrated very clearly that the Russian army is also stretched and struggles to fight on 2 fronts at once. And while the Russian population and resources are undoubtedly larger, there are signs that they're also running short of men and armor. Both countries are stretched to the limit, and so it becomes a kind of race to the bottom. Who tires first? The strain on civilian life is undoubtedly higher in Ukraine. 18% of territory occupied, its cities regularly under attack from drones, missiles, and glide bombs. And in Kyiv, where bells ring every day for those fallen and captured by Russia, Some Ukrainian officials will acknowledge privately that they're expecting this winter to be the most difficult of all, as Russia redoubles its efforts to knock out the electricity grid, causing residents to shiver and freeze in the dark. In the capital, I spoke to the man responsible for keeping the lights on, Vitaly Klitschko, the former boxer and mayor of Kyiv.
I'm nervous. It's, yes, of course, expectation from the winter. Winter is a huge challenge for us. They try to freezing our population to live in the winter difficult without electricity, heating, water.
And do you think the people in the street, the people in the cafes, the people in the bars that are full right now, they know what lies ahead in the coming months? Is the government, are you doing enough to tell them what is coming?
It's very important to be honest, to tell the people truth. And we calculate many different scenarios, and also worst case scenario, and that's why we tell to people we are responsible for that, but you have to count for yourself, you have to be prepared. Please, you need to have reserve of drink water in your home, food, battery, to survive in some period of time when you don't have services. Difficult, but people still unbroken.
Let's talk about the domestic political environment. It's been a long time, 2.5 years, and Ukrainians want victory, but they're also getting tired of being at war. How do you, as a political leader, how do you explain what victory is to people?
It's a difficult question. What does it mean to bring the peace back to Ukraine? To give up the big part of our territory? Because the Russians occupied Crimea, east part of Ukraine, and Russians told, let's find solution. Compromise. It's difficult to explain to the people it's solution to give up the big part of our homeland to Russians. It's not solution. It's compromise, it's not. But the wish for every Ukrainians to bring peace back to Ukraine. How long is the peace? Very difficult political solution, which have to do it President of Ukraine, Zelensky. His responsibility to do that. Listen, for this question, I guess nobody ready to give you a clear answer.
To find out whether that was true, I went to the real seat of power in Ukraine, the presidential compound.
We're now driving through the central district of Kyiv, going to the presidential offices to meet with Andriy Yermak, President Zelensky's chief of staff and right-hand man.
In an office that's increasingly centralizing control behind these checkpoints in the capital, I sat down with the man who matters.
So this victory plan, in short, is to give you the best and strongest position for any future peace negotiations.
It's possible to say so, but I always want to little bit clarify the phrase peace negotiations, because it's necessary to understand this is position of the president of all team that we don't trust Russia.
He points to previous agreements which have been broken and says Ukraine needs an ironclad guarantee, NATO membership.
It's the most strongest guarantees now which existing in the world. We understand that full membership is possible only after the war. But we don't see any problems, any difficulties, without any conditions to give the invitations to Ukraine. Because it's very much strengthening our positions.
Ukraine is looking at elections next year. In the wings, political challengers to President Zelensky are watching too. In our case, quite literally. When we speak to the mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, in his office, sitting quietly beside him is his younger brother, Vladimir. His name is being bandied about as a potential challenger. And while Vladimir is not a politician yet, he's learning.
There is no question with resilience. Question is more to you
and to the free world how much of endurance you have. Because without you, we would have been already gone. But with you, we're stronger.
I think there is a fatigue in the United States, a fatigue, and in Europe. It's not that people don't want to support Ukraine, it's that they have other concerns. It's not so high on the priorities. And so I ask you, if the endurance is not there from the West, not cutting off Ukraine, but just less support, which I think is the most likely, actually, less support, what happens then to your ability to be resilient, your ability to continue?
In my opinion, Putin's Russia, the longer it gets, the weaker Putin's Russia is going to get. That's in my personal opinion. Because, and the mayor said it right, when you think you're tired, think about the other side. They are exhausted too. And they call for the peace.
But like almost all Ukrainians, he believes Russia will only use any ceasefire or negotiated end to the war to regroup and attack again.
We know they will come back. And now it's the choice. When they're going to be back, they're going to be stronger and better. I believe that now all in or nothing. That's my personal opinion, all in or nothing, because the other opponent, the other side, is exhausted too, tremendously exhausted. And I believe now is the moment of time where we just need to put our strength together.
And so what does that look like?
We cannot only rely on our heroic people, our heroic soldiers. We need to have significant support with the artillery, with the tanks, and again, with the permission, with the long-range weapon.
I'm sitting with Major General Volodymyr Khabarchuk, Deputy Chief of the General Staff. He's a senior commanding officer with direct influence over the Army's strategic decisions.
What do you need for Ukraine to be able to defend its borders? Do you need to be a member of NATO? As a military man, what will you need to have to be able to defend your country even after this war is finished?
As the old Greek philosopher said, the strong do what they do and the weaker suffer what they must. In that regard, nothing changes. We need to be strong, definitely.
But can Ukraine ever be strong enough on its own? Imagine if Russia, rearmed and reinvigorated, decides to breach whatever peace deal is agreed. That risk is real. It's happened before. So the big question is, what will deter Russia from doing it again?
From my understanding, first, as a NATO member, there is some guarantee that we will not have that horrible war in future with Russia. But if not, we need to be much more stronger than we are now in order to prevent the aggression. We need to be prepared ourselves, Ukrainians.
And do you, even if you are not a NATO member country, does your military force need to be interoperable with NATO member countries?
By no doubt of that, 100%. And I think now we are not only taking experience and knowledge from our NATO partners, definitely we have something to share with the NATO members country as well.
Ukraine has one of the only armies to have fought a major land war in recent decades. And it's definitely the only one which has fought Russia. As a result, they're at the cutting edge of modern warfare, whether it's in terms of drone technology, communications, or even battlefield medicine.
Wow. It's amazing. It's made out of fresh wood. It smells of wood. It looks like a sauna.
Okay.
Looks like a sauna.
Yes, this is
amazing.
This is the red zone. We call them the red zone.
This is the red zone?
The most hardest arrives here.
This is the worst cases arrive here. We're walking through a wood-blocked or into an under. This is the operating theatre?
This is the operation model.
Into a fully functional operating theatre. And I can see the operating table.
I'm in an operating room at an underground medical stabilization point, not far from the front lines.
Concentrator.
A concentrator. And at the back there, what is that thing? That sterilization machine right on the back left. huge amounts of equipment, and it's all in an underground, 10 meters? Ventilation,
air condition, and
to almost 1 meter 80, 1 meter 90.
The radius is 2.5 meters.
2.5 meter radius.
Roman Kuziv is the chief medic here. He designed the whole thing, and then his colleagues spent 3 months digging it out, stabilizing it with wood, and kitting it out with a lot of high-grade medical technology. Part of the reason it's made out of wood is that if, or Roman thinks when, the Russians find out this location and launch a strike, any shrapnel damage from wood will be less than concrete. He tells me that evacuating wounded soldiers from the front line is incredibly difficult. Russia doesn't just ignore the Geneva Conventions about hitting medical personnel. He says they no longer put red crosses or anything that might identify medics on their vehicles because they are actively targeted. And so wounded soldiers have to lie where they fall until it gets dark, and a secret rescue mission can be mounted. It means that the NATO standard of the golden hour, getting soldiers to a facility within the first hour of injury, is a total fiction when it comes to how this war is actually being fought. And so the Ukrainians have stepped up what they're able to do. From the moment they collect their soldiers, instead of transporting them to hospitals far from the front lines, they treat them here.
This is the full ICU, so someone comes in here if they're not breathing, not really
we use
serious
for
issues.
this the torque and you see the monitor, cardio monitor, ventilation, aspiration, capnograph.
And so the question turns to America. In January 2025, will it have a president who continues to support Ukraine, who presses for its accession to NATO, or one who abandons it? At a conference in Kyiv in September, I put that question to President Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. He pushes back hard on the idea that another Trump presidency would be a disaster for Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin didn't attack when President Trump was in office. We have 4 years of history. Actually, I'll take that back. We have 15 and a half years of history. 8 years of Barack Obama, 4 years of President Trump, and now 3.5 years of President Biden. Any question for the Ukrainian people of those years, which were the years that they were safest and didn't have any of their land stolen by a thug coming out of Russia?
He thinks the real damage has been done by a frightened and indecisive Biden administration.
They piecemealed it out. So a little bit here, a little bit there, and then adjacent to that always spoke about the risk of escalation instead of the opportunity for victory. And that is it's a psychological shortcoming, right? It's a model that says when you're constantly telling your adversary the things you won't do or your friends the things they can't do because, quote, escalation, end of quote, you're empowering the bad guys to test your model, to test how far they can push.
The difficulty is that if President Trump wins the election in November, it's not clear what kind of Trump foreign policy the world will get. Will it be a Pompeo Trump, or a version more in line with his running mate J.D. Vance, who opposed the most recent assistance package and has said that he, quote, doesn't really care about Ukraine?
No one should labor under a fantasy that there is anyone resembling Rex Tillerson or General Mattis ever getting within a mile of Trump's White House. His national security team is going to be the creepiest, most reckless group of hyper-isolationists you have ever seen.
Senator Chris Murphy is a prominent member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a man who might end up with a big job if it's Kamala Harris who wins the upcoming election.
I think there'll be continuity between Biden and Harris when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Obviously, there'll be some differences. I can't speak to exactly what pace of delivery and what systems Kamala Harris will be most interested in. Kamala Harris is going to fight for Ukraine. That's the difference in this election.
With the election on a knife edge and American support unclear, could Europe step up to help Ukraine win the war?
I think Europe is capable to step up a lot.
General Freuding is one of Germany's top soldiers.
Christian Freuding, I'm the Director of Joint Planning and Command Staff in the Ministry of Defense of Germany.
And he thinks this represents an opportunity for Europe.
Especially as the European defense market is very small and the possibilities to increase defense production are limited. So this is a new opportunity we would like to look into. And of course, this would be of mutual benefit for the Ukrainians, but for the whole European defense market as well.
Do you think the Ukrainians now have capabilities that others in NATO do not have? And are there things you can and will learn from them?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. We want to learn from them, we must learn from them, because the nature of war has changed during the last 2 years. And we have to learn from that, and we have to adapt, and we have to do this very fast. It is the most experienced armed forces we have in Europe at this time, and it would be rather be stupid not to get the chance or to use the chance to learn from them.
He told me it's clear to him that Ukraine must join NATO. And the fact that Ukraine doesn't control all of its territory is not the obstacle that some believe. After all, West Germany joined NATO long before its reunification.
I don't think history repeats itself.
But it rhymes.
But it rhymes sometimes, and sometimes you can get inspiration from his historic examples.
Not everyone is in lockstep with this NATO idea. Senator Chris Murphy thinks it could be a distraction.
I think right now, Ukraine's focus has to be on winning this war and not spending an inordinate amount of energy trying to ultimately win a future invitation to join NATO.
I think the political logic in Kiev for doing that is that it helps domestically sell something that is not quite total victory as you describe it.
Vlad?
Hi,
yes,
are you Vlad?
I'm Vlad.
Hi,
yes.
so nice to meet you. I feel like I know you. I've been listening to your voice.
Oh,
I'm Zani, Minton Beddoes.
In Kramatorsk, I finally meet Vlad, our commander on the front, sending us voice memos from the dugout. We head to a quiet cafe.
Would you like some food?
Телека виключимо, добре, тут. Ми попишемо звук, ви нас сильно не кричіть на нас. If it's okay, because I'm starving a little bit.
Eat, of course.
Is okay?
Eat,
so
eat whatever you want.
Okay, nice.
Absolutely.
I'll order some food.
He tells me he was a photographer before the war. He mostly did weddings. But he very much looks the part of a soldier now. And his uniform is immaculate. He joined up in the first days after the full-scale invasion, was sent to Bucha and Irpin. He's seen a lot, and lost friends. I asked him, if his leaders negotiate a deal that means Russia gets to keep some of the territory it has seized, can that ever feel like victory?
No, it's not a victory. It's not a victory, it's lose. It's a victory for Russia. And I can only imagine what will come after that with the people who are not on the war. Because as I feel, most of them think like, okay, victory, come on, army, we are fighting, sitting on their couches. And they will be so much disappointed, like, what? Where is our borders of 91? So I'm afraid it will be some, again, revolution and all this, and Russia will take advantage of that.
That's the crux of the problem President Zelensky finds himself in right now. Having spent more than 2 years defining victory in absolutist terms, pushing the Russians out of all the territory they've occupied since 2014, it's hard now for him, or for any other Ukrainian politician, to settle for anything less. But at the same time, it's clear that Ukraine will not be able to push the Russians out completely and regain all its land by force. The real question is whether Ukraine can hold onto the territory it still controls, and whether the West will give it a credible security guarantee. But no one is willing to admit this publicly in Kiev. A political cowardice enabled by Ukraine's Western partners, because they hide behind the mantra that Ukraine must win, and that Ukrainians alone will determine what victory looks like. This is a recipe for disaster. The war cannot continue at today's intensity indefinitely. The risk is that Ukraine's defenses will buckle and its society fracture. Far from becoming the prosperous, westward-oriented democracy it aspires to be, Ukraine could lose and descend into chaos, an angry, embittered population, aggrieved at what it sees as Western perfidy and with heavily armed partisan militias. That would be a catastrophe for Ukraine and for the West. To avoid that outcome, Ukraine and its Western backers will need to be both bold and realistic. Mr. Zelensky will have to convince his fellow Ukrainians that the focus for now has to be for Ukraine to become a prosperous country that can defend the territory it has. And Ukraine's Western partners need to give it the wherewithal to do so. That will demand more weapons, more money to build up Ukraine's own defense industry, and in my view at least, the most credible of all guarantees, an invitation to join NATO. A well-defended, prosperous Ukraine that is firmly part of the West, that is the right definition of victory. And it is one that I suspect most Ukrainians would settle for.
Honestly, it's a third year of the war, of my war, sitting here. I am too tired to tell, no, I will fight till the end, I will put my life, no, we will not do any exceptions, we will go to the borders of 91st year. No, I'm too tired, honestly. I will be upset, of course, but not so much to become a partisan and to go in a forest to fight till the end.
This episode of The Weekend Intelligence was presented by Zeni Minton-Beddoes and produced by Heidi Pett, with reporting from Oliver Carroll, Arkady Ostrovsky, Marta Radionova, and Anastasia Parafenyuk. Sound engineering by Carla Patella and Alex Port-Felix. The executive producer of The Weekend Intelligence is Gemma Newby. If you want to hear more about Ukraine, join our live event on October 25th. With its forces under pressure, winter approaching, and the future of American support uncertain, our editors will be discussing crunch time for Ukraine. Economist subscribers can click the link in the show notes to sign up.